Ma'am, this is a court of law. You will remove that military decoration immediately. The cold voice of Judge Sandra Whitmore cracked through the courtroom like lightning during a silent storm. Heads turned. Pens stopped scribbling. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to hush. Everyone's eyes shifted to the woman standing tall at the front of the courtroom. Not a defendant, not a criminal, but a soldier, a general. General Helena Morris, her posture rigid and unwavering, stood in full army dress uniform. Every pin and stripe on her jacket carried a story: combat, sacrifice, leadership. And at the center of it all, just above her left breast, gleamed her Distinguished Service Cross, a rare honor second only to the Medal of Honor. It had been awarded to her after leading a 36-hour mission under enemy fire, rescuing 12 American hostages without losing a single soldier. Her face had been on the cover of military magazines, her name spoken with reverence in Pentagon halls. Now she was being asked, no, ordered, to remove the very medal that symbolized everything she had sacrificed for the country. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her gaze locked on the judge with calm fire. I'm sorry, Your Honor. This medal was earned. It stays. Gasps swept the courtroom like a wave crashing on rocks. Judge Whitmore's face reddened. She leaned forward, her knuckles tightening on the bench. Then I'll hold you in contempt of court, she hissed. This is MY Courtroom. General Morris stood like a mountain, unshaken. And this is MY Country, Your Honor. I didn't wear this for decoration. I wore it for justice. That's when everyone realized this hearing was about to go places none of them expected. A battle not on the battlefield. This wasn't some criminal trial where Helena was on the defense. No, she had come voluntarily as a character witness for a young black soldier named Private Darnell Rivers, who had been dishonorably discharged after a wrongful arrest by local police. The soldier had done nothing wrong, caught in the wrong place, wrong skin color, wrong assumptions. His military record was spotless, but a night out in civilian clothes ended with him tackled by officers who claimed he looked suspicious. The Army began to push for reinstatement, but local resistance was strong. The court hearing today was supposed to be simple: testimony from high-ranking officers who vouched for Rivers' integrity. Helena came because she believed in the truth, and because she'd seen too many good men fall through the cracks. But the judge had other ideas. The judge's hidden grudge, what no one in the room except Helena knew, was that she and Judge Whitmore had history. Years ago, when Helena was a lieutenant colonel, she had been part of a Department of Defense audit team. Their task: investigate fraudulent military contractor activity in California. Millions of dollars were unaccounted for. Her team followed the money trail straight to a company, Whitmore Solutions, LLC. The owner? Richard Whitmore, the judge's husband. Helena's final report didn't just sink the company. It got the man blacklisted from future government contracts. He wasn't charged, but his empire crumbled, and his wife, who was still climbing the judicial ladder at the time, had quietly taken his side. Now, years later, with the world watching, Judge Whitmore saw a chance to strike back. A petty, personal vendetta dressed in the robes of justice. And she was going to humiliate the general to do it. Honor meets power. You were not instructed to wear your uniform in this courtroom, the judge said sharply. There was no restriction, Helena replied calmly. Wearing it is within my rights under U.S. Code Section 772. I'm here as a service member and a citizen. Don't lecture me on law, General, the judge snapped. Helena took a slow breath. She knew this wasn't about uniform code. It wasn't even about Darnell Rivers anymore. This was about power. But there was something the judge didn't know. Helena hadn't come alone. Her commanding officers were watching via live stream. So was the Secretary of the Army. And so were a few journalists who'd caught wind of the hearing's odd behavior before it even began. The court clerk shifted nervously. The bailiff, himself a former Marine, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. And just then, the doors at the back of the room creaked open. The unexpected visitor, a tall man in a dark suit, stepped in, flanked by two aides. He moved quickly, quietly, carrying a sealed folder. He approached the clerk, handed her the folder, and whispered something. The clerk's eyes widened. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, voice trembling slightly. "This document was just delivered from the Department of Defense, Office of Legal Counsel. It includes a request that all military customs and courtesies be upheld for General Morris as an active duty officer." The room erupted into murmurs. The judge froze. Helena remained silent, but the corner of her mouth curved ever so slightly. The judge cleared her throat, grasping for control. "This is highly unusual," she said. But it was too late. The story was out. The cameras were on. The judge's actions had triggered a national-level response. The internet doesn't miss by the time court recessed for lunch. Photos of General Helena Morris standing proudly in uniform, refusing to back down, had gone viral. Hashtag Stand with General Morris was trending. Veterans shared their stories. Soldiers posted photos of their own medals. Black leaders spoke out. Talk shows picked it up mid-broadcast. The full courtroom transcript was being shared line by line on Twitter. By the time Helena returned to court for the afternoon session, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Even the judge looked shaken, her usual sharp tone replaced by awkward formality. But the damage was already done. The Ethics Committee for the State Judiciary had received dozens of formal complaints. The governor's office issued a statement calling for respect and dignity toward all members of the U.S. military. And 2 senators called for a review of Judge Whitmore's conduct. When power fails and honor wins, the case itself ended swiftly. With Helena's testimony and mounting public pressure, Private Rivers was cleared. His dishonorable discharge was reversed. He would return to active duty with full benefits. As for Helena, she walked out of that courtroom not with shame, but with a standing ovation from the people gathered outside. Veterans, journalists, activists, ordinary citizens. She didn't say much, just a firm nod, a humble salute, and the same calm strength she had carried through war zones and boardrooms alike. Later that night, while relaxing in her quarters, Helena received a call. "Helena," the voice said, "we're putting Judge Whitmore under full investigation. You've done more than protect one soldier. You've shaken a system." She hung up the phone quietly, looked at her medal, and whispered, "Still earned." Epilogue: 1 medal, many lessons. Judge Sandra Whitmore tendered her resignation 2 weeks later. The official reason was health and family. But everyone knew the truth. The justice system had tried to strip a soldier of her dignity, and failed. General Helena Morris didn't just defend her honor. She reminded the world that medals aren't decorations. They're symbols of courage, of sacrifice, and of integrity. And sometimes, standing your ground in a courtroom can be just as heroic as standing your ground on the battlefield. This wasn't some criminal trial, not a high-stakes lawsuit, not even a civil dispute. General Helena Morris wasn't on trial, at least not in the legal sense. She had come to this small-town courtroom as a witness, nothing more. She wasn't summoned, she volunteered. She made the trip herself, flying overnight from D.C. to this quiet county in the middle of nowhere. Not because she had to, but because she refused to stay silent. At the heart of it was Private Darnell Rivers, a young black soldier barely 20, with a spotless record, 3 years into service, and a reputation for discipline and heart. His fellow soldiers respected him. His commanding officers praised him. But none of that stopped what happened one Friday night on leave. Walking home from a late movie, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, Darnell was stopped by local police. They claimed he matched a description. What followed was an all-too-familiar story: accusations without evidence, force without cause, and an arrest that spiraled into a dishonorable discharge based solely on an incident report filled with holes. The Army, under pressure, initiated a review. Legal advocates got involved. Community groups protested. And in the middle of it all, one name kept surfacing: General Helena Morris, the highest-ranking officer who had once mentored Darnell at an ROTC camp and remembered his dedication. She didn't hesitate. She arranged to testify at the hearing that could clear his name and restore his service. But Helena didn't just arrive. She showed up in full-dress uniform, medals and all. She wasn't required to. There was no mandate. But her decision was deliberate. She wanted the court, the town, the system, to see who Darnell Rivers had behind him. She wanted to make one thing unmistakably clear. This boy mattered. The second she walked into that courtroom, the energy shifted. She wasn't loud. She didn't have to be. Her presence did the speaking. The sharp-cut uniform, the polished black shoes, the confident steps of a woman who had walked through war zones and returned stronger. Her medals caught the light as she passed each row of pews. The Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and most noticeable of all, the Distinguished Service Cross, resting proudly on her chest, just above her heart. To most people in the room, that medal was a symbol of extraordinary valor, an award only given to those who had risked death for their fellow soldiers. To the veterans sitting quietly in the back, it was a sign of greatness. To Darnell's mother, sitting in the second row with tears in her eyes, it was a sign of hope. But to Judge Sandra Whitmore, it was something else entirely. The moment Helena stepped into the room, the judge's demeanor shifted. What should have been a routine procedure started to feel tense. Her glances turned to glares. Her questions became barbed. Her voice sharpened like a blade dipped in vinegar. Everyone noticed. At first, people thought maybe it was just courtroom formality. Some judges were known to be strict. Some preferred plainclothes testimony. But as Helena took the stand and began calmly detailing Darnell's spotless military record, the atmosphere cracked. "General Morris," the judge interrupted, voice laced with scorn, "your appearance today is drawing undue attention. I will ask you once to remove that medal. This is not a parade." The entire courtroom froze. Darnell's attorney sat bolt upright. Darnell's mother audibly gasped. But Helena, she didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She looked the judge dead in the eyes and replied with quiet fire, "Your Honor, this medal was not given for show. It represents blood spilled and lives saved. I earned it, and I wear it with honor." The judge's lip curled. "This is my courtroom, and I expect compliance." "Then perhaps," Helena said evenly, "you should ask yourself why honoring a soldier's sacrifice makes you uncomfortable." The bailiff, a former Marine himself, glanced up from his post, his jaw tight. Everyone could feel it now. This wasn't about legal decorum. This was personal. Because what the courtroom didn't know was this. Helena and Judge Whitmore had history. Years ago, Helena had led a Pentagon investigation into military contract fraud. Millions of taxpayer dollars funneled into fake invoices, shady shell companies, and corrupt partnerships. Helena's team uncovered names, companies, and one key player, Whitmore Defense Solutions. At the time, it was owned by none other than Richard Whitmore, the judge's husband. Helena's report didn't indict him, but it shut his business down. The Department of Defense blacklisted the company. He lost government access. He lost big-money clients. And he never recovered. Behind closed doors, the judge had raged. But she couldn't touch Helena, not then. Now, she had her chance. A small courtroom, a small case, a uniformed woman standing tall in her presence. This wasn't about a medal. This was about power. And she intended to strip Helena of hers, right there, on record, on camera, in front of Darnell's family and local press. But she had severely underestimated one thing. Helena Morris did not back down. Not to terrorists. Not to pressure. And certainly not to bitterness in a black robe. "You will remove that medal immediately." The judge barked again, voice shaking now. "No, ma'am," Helena replied, her voice as steady as steel. "Not today. Not ever." The courtroom, now fully alert, leaned in. Judge Whitmore looked around, suddenly aware that people were no longer afraid of her authority. They were watching, judging her, not Helena. Still, she pressed on. "Then I will hold you in contempt of court." "Do what you must," Helena said, "but I will not dishonor the men who died in my arms to make that medal possible." A moment of silence passed so thick you could feel it pressing against the skin. Then came a shuffle at the back of the room. A court clerk hurried in with a sealed envelope. She rushed to the front and whispered urgently in the judge's ear. The judge's face dropped. The clerk cleared her throat and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have just received formal notice from the Department of Defense Office of Legal Counsel. They are requesting that full military honors be recognized in this courtroom for General Morris, and they are now observing these proceedings remotely. A gasp. Then silence. Helena said nothing. She didn't need to. Her reputation had arrived before her, and it had backup. Within minutes, what had started as an attempt to humiliate a decorated general became a national incident. Local reporters live tweeting the scene, found their phones exploding. Hashtag respect the uniform, hashtag General Morris, hashtag restore Darnell. They all started trending within the hour. Within a day, veterans groups across the country released statements. Talk shows demanded accountability. Civil rights organizations called for the judge's removal. And within 72 hours, Judge Sandra Whitmore was suspended pending investigation. It didn't take long after that for her to resign. But General Helena Morris? She didn't just leave with her medal. She left with the courtroom's respect, Darnell's future restored, and a reminder to the world, honor cannot be silenced. And truth, when worn boldly, defeats even the bitterest gavel. People in the courtroom didn't know it yet. They saw a confident black woman in uniform standing tall, firm, and calm in the face of a judge's hostility. They saw medals. They saw dignity. They saw strength. What they didn't see was the storm swirling beneath the surface. A storm born years earlier, in the Pentagon, long before General Helena Morris and Judge Sandra Whitmore ever crossed paths in that courtroom. But Helena remembered everything, because this wasn't the first time she had faced Sandra Whitmore. And they weren't strangers. It all began 12 years earlier, when Helena was a lieutenant colonel, sharp, focused, and known throughout the military for her no-nonsense leadership style. At the time, she had been assigned to a joint investigative task force aimed at cracking down on defense contract fraud. Billions were being siphoned off through overpriced gear, fake vendors, and shell companies. It was dirty work, high-level corruption. Politicians, private CEOs, even military personnel were under scrutiny. The deeper the task force dug, the more powerful the names that surfaced. Helena had a reputation for going where others wouldn't. She didn't care about stepping on toes. She only cared about serving her country honestly. Her job was simple: follow the money. And that's exactly what she did. One name kept popping up on invoices, reports, and financial trails: Whitmore Tactical Solutions. At first glance, it looked like any other private military contractor. Based out of Virginia, provided gear and logistics consulting. Dozens of contracts with the Department of Defense. Millions of dollars in revenue. But Helena's team discovered troubling patterns. Duplicate invoices. Non-existent services. Training contracts that were never fulfilled. Radios that were never delivered. Tactical gear that didn't exist, on paper or in real life. It was a classic scam. And at the head of it, Richard Whitmore. He was polished, slick, and politically connected. Married to a rising star in the judiciary, Sandra Whitmore, a state-level judge who was rumored to be next in line for a federal bench. The investigation was intense. Every lead brought more pressure. Helena's superior officers warned her to tread carefully. But she didn't flinch. She compiled a 182-page report documenting every fraudulent invoice, every false claim, every crooked subcontractor linked to Whitmore's operation. It was airtight. Helena's signature was at the bottom of the report that went straight to the Pentagon's Office of the Inspector General. The fallout was immediate. Whitmore Tactical Solutions was blacklisted from future government contracts. Over $9.7 million in payments were frozen. Several top employees were indicted. Richard Whitmore wasn't criminally charged, but his company was publicly shamed, and his name dragged through every military contractor news cycle for months. He lost everything: the contracts, the prestige, the access. And Judge Sandra Whitmore, she was furious. She didn't make public statements, but behind the scenes, she made calls. She accused investigators of overreach. She tried to shield her husband's reputation, but it was too late. Helena's report had killed the company, and Sandra never forgot it. Years passed. Helena rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a general, the second black woman in U.S. history to hold that title in the Army. Sandra, too, advanced her career. She secured a powerful judicial appointment in her state and carefully maintained an image of fairness, professionalism, and control. But resentment doesn't fade when left unchecked, and Helena could see it in her eyes the moment she entered that courtroom years later. dressed in full uniform, there to defend Private Darnell Rivers, a young soldier facing racial injustice. As soon as Helena stepped into the room, Judge Whitmore's gaze locked on her with cold recognition. There it was. The past, the bitterness, the unfinished score. From that moment on, the hearing was no longer just about Darnell Rivers. It became a personal mission for Judge Whitmore. She interrupted Helena's testimony. She questioned her motives. She raised her voice. And then, with the audacity of someone drunk on authority, she said the unthinkable. "You will remove that medal immediately. This is not a military base. It's a court of law." The courtroom gasped. The bailiff froze. Even the court reporter's hands hovered above the keyboard in disbelief. But Helena, she was calm. She knew exactly what this was about. This wasn't about courtroom protocol. This wasn't about respect or rules. This was about revenge. Judge Whitmore saw her chance, not just to reassert dominance, but to publicly humiliate the very woman she believed destroyed her husband's life. In her mind, Helena had cost them millions, had ruined Richard's name, had embarrassed them in front of political allies. And now, in her courtroom, Sandra could finally get even. What better way than to tear down Helena's image? Strip her of her most sacred symbol of honor, her Distinguished Service Cross, the medal awarded for saving American lives under enemy fire, pinned just above her heart. To the judge, it was a piece of metal. To Helena, it was a sacred memory, one earned in fire and pain. She had received it after leading a high-risk extraction mission in Afghanistan. The odds were impossible. 12 American engineers were trapped in a collapsed compound, surrounded by hostiles. No way in, no way out. Helena had personally led the rescue team. She took enemy fire. She shielded wounded men with her own body. She fought tooth and nail to get everyone out alive. She almost died. That medal wasn't a trophy. It was a testament. And now, the very person who once tried to protect a fraud was demanding she remove it. In public, in court, on record, in front of witnesses and cameras. It should have worked. It could have worked. Had Helena been someone else, timid, fearful, apologetic, it might have. But General Helena Morris didn't rise through the ranks by shrinking in the face of injustice. She stood her ground. "I earned this," she said, voice calm, resolute. "And it stays." The room held its breath. The judge's face turned red with fury. She was about to lash out again, perhaps issue a contempt order, when something unexpected happened. The back doors of the courtroom opened. A man in a sharp suit entered briskly, carrying a folder. He walked directly to the clerk, said something in a whisper, and handed over the sealed document. The clerk's face turned pale. She rose. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "we've just received notice from the Department of Defense. The Secretary's office is now monitoring this hearing. They've submitted a formal request that all military protocol be respected and that General Morris remain in full uniform, including her decorations." The courtroom exploded in whispers. Judge Whitmore's authority shattered in real time, because what she hadn't counted on was that the Pentagon was watching, and they weren't going to let one bitter judge drag a decorated war hero through the mud unchecked. Within hours, the incident went viral. Veterans organizations issued public statements of support for General Morris. Political leaders demanded an ethics investigation. #StandWithGeneralMorris trended nationwide. The moment Judge Whitmore tried to rip off that medal, she ripped off the mask she'd worn for years. The mask of impartiality. The mask of professionalism. The public saw her for what she was, a judge blinded by vengeance, trying to abuse her power to settle a personal score. And the fallout came fast. Within 72 hours, Judge Whitmore was placed on administrative leave. A week later, she resigned. Personal reasons, the statement read. But everyone knew better. Her career ended not in scandal, but in disgrace. Meanwhile, General Helena Morris left that courtroom with her medal still pinned, her dignity intact, and Private Darnell Rivers' name cleared. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply walked out of that building the same way she walked into every battlefield, with calm resolve and the quiet strength of someone who knows what true power really is. Because power isn't yelling from a bench. Power is standing tall, speaking truth, and never, ever, removing your honor for someone else's bitterness. Just as Judge Sandra Whitmore raised her gavel and barked her second threat of contempt, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned. A sharply dressed man in a tailored black suit stepped in with swift precision. He wasn't part of the legal team. He wasn't local. You could tell by his posture, rigid, direct, and the thick, embossed folder he held under his arm. Without a word, he made his way to the front of the courtroom. His polished shoes clicked against the floor. His face didn't break into a smile. His pace didn't slow. He walked straight to the court clerk, leaned down, and whispered something barely audible. The clerk's face changed instantly. One moment composed. The next pale, alert, nervous. She scanned the contents of the folder, then stood so suddenly her chair rolled back with a screech. Everyone jolted. "Your Honor," she said carefully, her voice tight. "I've just received formal instruction from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. They are now actively monitoring these proceedings remotely." The room gasped. Whispers flooded the gallery. The clerk continued, holding up the document for the judge to see. "They have submitted an amicus brief, formally requesting that full respect be shown to all uniformed military personnel present in this court, in accordance with federal guidelines and protocol. This includes the right to wear awarded decorations, specifically the Distinguished Service Cross currently worn by General Helena Morris." The courtroom went dead silent. Then everything changed. Judge Whitmore's face drained of color. Her hand trembled slightly on the bench. She looked as if the floor had just been pulled out from under her. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was the Pentagon stepping in, mid-proceeding, to defend General Morris, and not through whispers or private calls. They had made their presence known, officially and on record. The judge's lips parted like she might argue, but no sound came out. She looked at the man in the black suit, who gave a small nod, confirming that everything in that folder was real, and it came straight from Washington. The gavel never dropped. The threat of contempt faded from the air, like smoke caught in a breeze. Helena said nothing. She didn't have to. She remained standing, straight-backed, head high, her metal gleaming like a quiet flame in the center of the storm. But inside, she knew exactly who had orchestrated this. Back at the Pentagon, she had friends. Not just acquaintances, not just officers. Friends, real ones, people she'd trained, commanders she'd led through combat zones, generals she'd mentored, civilians whose careers she'd protected with the same tenacity she showed on the battlefield. They weren't going to let one bitter judge tear her down. Not without a fight. One phone call. That's all it took. Someone watching that courtroom feed had seen enough, and they'd pulled the alarm. Social media exploded within minutes. Courtroom journalists and legal bloggers, who had quietly been live tweeting what they assumed would be a routine hearing, suddenly realized they were witnessing something historic. Breaking. Pentagon intervenes mid-courtroom after judge orders decorated general to remove honor medal. Hashtag General Morris stands her ground. Judge forced to back down after federal intervention. Courtroom turns into a battlefield of dignity, honor, and power. General wins without raising her voice. Hashtags lit up the internet. Hashtag respect General Morris. Hashtag honor the uniform. Hashtag contempt of bias. Hashtag women in uniform. Hashtag judicial revenge within 30 minutes. National media picked it up. Military news outlets replayed courtroom audio. Talk show hosts ran breaking segments. Veterans organizations issued statements of support. Prominent civil rights figures praised Helena's grace under fire. Even Hollywood actors and athletes shared their outrage online. The courtroom, once quiet and unnoticed, had become the center of national attention. But while the world was discovering what had happened, Helena remained calm, still standing, still silent, still proud. To her, this wasn't about going viral. This was about principle, about justice, about making sure that Private Darnell Rivers, the young soldier she had come to defend, knew that someone like him, black, young, honorable, deserved to be backed by the full force of the uniform he wore. She looked over at him now, seated beside his lawyer. His eyes were wide. His hands were clasped tight in his lap. But when he met her gaze, he nodded, Just once. A silent thank you. A thank you that said everything. And still it wasn't over. Behind the scenes, emails were flying. Phones were ringing. Within the next hour, 2 members of the Judicial Ethics Committee had called the courthouse directly, requesting transcripts and video records of the incident. They had questions. Big ones. Questions about judicial conduct. Questions about bias and personal conflicts of interest. Because even though Helena hadn't mentioned her past with Judge Whitmore in open court, someone had done their research. By the time the final recess was called, a full inquiry was already underway into Judge Whitmore's conduct, both in this case and her long unaddressed connections to her husband's past business dealings. The very husband Helena had investigated years earlier. It all began to unravel. Court adjourned quietly that day. No gavel. No shouting. No forced removals. Just the sound of a room learning what real power looks like. Helena walked out surrounded by supporters, lawyers, and media waiting with microphones and questions. She didn't stop for long. She gave one brief statement. I stood for a soldier today, just as others have stood for me. We wear these uniforms not for show, but for the people we protect. That includes the young man inside who nearly lost everything to a broken system. Justice matters. Dignity matters. And so does truth. Then she walked down the steps, her head held high, her medal still in place, her name now etched in the national conversation. Within 24 hours, over 5 million people had seen the story. By the next morning, 2 members of Congress had called for an emergency review of judicial treatment toward active military personnel in civilian courtrooms. Judge Whitmore, she didn't return to court the next day, or the next. Instead, her office issued a statement that she was taking a leave of absence due to personal stress. But everyone knew what it really meant. By the end of the week, she had formally resigned. The Judicial Ethics Committee had enough complaints, enough coverage, and enough evidence to move forward with a full disciplinary review. Her career, once so carefully built, had collapsed under the weight of her own bitterness. Helena hadn't needed to raise her voice. She didn't scream, threaten, or retaliate. She just stood tall, held her ground, and let the world witness the truth. And Darnell, the young man whose case had brought her there in the first place, he was reinstated, with full rank, full back pay, and a personal letter from the Secretary of the Army acknowledging his wrongful discharge. He later said the only reason he stayed strong during the entire ordeal was because he saw her standing there, not just as a general, but as a living reminder that the uniform still meant something. Sometimes, real battles aren't fought with guns or bombs. They're fought in courtrooms, in whispers, in power plays, and sometimes the loudest victory comes not from yelling, but from a woman in a uniform refusing to take off the one thing she earned with her life, and reminding the world that honor doesn't ask permission to exist. The very next morning, the courtroom that had once buzzed with tension stood silent. The American flag in the corner barely moved in the air-conditioned stillness. No voices, no gavel, no lines of lawyers waiting their turn, just emptiness. Judge Sandra Whitmore's bench sat untouched. Her chair remained pushed back slightly, as if she had risen in a rush and never returned. She hadn't, because as the sun rose that day, the world had already changed. Judge Whitmore's outburst, the moment she demanded a decorated black general remove her Distinguished Service Cross, had become the headline across every major news outlet in the country. Clips of the exchange were looped across social media, television, and news sites. CNN replayed the moment every hour. Fox News debated whether it was a judicial overreach or personal vendetta. MSNBC brought on military experts who stared at the camera in disbelief, asking, "What kind of judge doesn't know what that medal represents?" Veterans groups moved fast. Statements poured in from organizations large and small, from American Legion posts to Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Former generals spoke up on live interviews. "That medal is sacred," one Vietnam vet said. "Trying to strip it off a hero in court? That's not justice. That's vengeance." Civil rights organizations were just as swift. NAACP, ACLU, and dozens of local leaders issued joint letters condemning Judge Whitmore's actions and calling for her removal. A dozen senators released a bipartisan statement demanding a full ethics investigation. Even the White House press secretary was asked about the incident. Her response was clear. We believe every service member deserves our respect, especially those who've risked their lives for this country. We trust the judicial review system will take the appropriate action. And it did. Within 72 hours, the gavel fell for the last time. Judge Sandra Whitmore was officially placed on administrative leave, pending a formal inquiry into her conduct. Her office issued a carefully worded statement. Judge Whitmore is stepping back from her duties temporarily to allow a full and fair review of the recent events. But the public didn't buy it, because it wasn't just one bad moment. It was everything: the tone, the history, the arrogance. And it all came to a head when the world watched her try to publicly humiliate a woman who had spent her life protecting freedom. Within days, she submitted her formal resignation. The statement claimed personal reasons and a desire to focus on family and health. But no one believed that either, because the damage was already done, and her career? Finished. The judge who once wielded her gavel like a sword of authority was now just another cautionary tale of ego, bitterness, and the cost of forgetting humility. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, General Helena Morris was returning to base. And she wasn't returning quietly. When her plane landed, fellow soldiers were already waiting for her. Rows of salutes greeted her exit. Applause rang out. Even civilians at the nearby gates stopped and stared, recognizing her from the headlines. She stepped off the ramp still wearing her uniform, still wearing the medal, still standing tall. Cameras flashed. Reporters pushed forward. Questions flew. One voice called out louder than the rest. General Morris, are you angry about what happened? Helena stopped. She turned toward the camera with a small, thoughtful smile. No bitterness, no smugness, just that same calm, resolute strength that had carried her through war zones, political rooms, and now a courtroom. I've faced combat, she said plainly. I've flown helicopters into enemy fire. I've watched friends bleed beside me, and still we stood tall. You think a bitter judge was going to shake me? The crowd around her erupted in applause. She gave no long speech, no victory lap, just a respectful nod before walking on. Back on base, her fellow officers welcomed her with open arms. In the mess hall, someone had placed a poster with her picture and the words, "Real honor doesn't fold under pressure." A private who had just joined 2 weeks prior told her, "Ma'am, I didn't know who I wanted to be in this army until I saw you in that courtroom." She smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Then keep your chin up. You'll do fine." News cameras captured footage of her speaking to younger cadets, reminding them to always lead with integrity, even when the world doubts them. One young woman asked, "How do you keep going when they try to tear you down?" Helena paused. Then she said something those in the room would never forget. "You don't carry medals to show you're better. You carry them to remind yourself of what you've survived. And if you earned it, you never take it off. Not for anyone." Later that week, the Pentagon held a private recognition for her. It wasn't an award ceremony. It wasn't meant for headlines. It was a simple gathering of high-ranking officials and peers, men and women who had watched the courtroom footage, seen how she handled herself, and wanted to say something very rare in D.C. "Thank you." One admiral hugged her and said, "You didn't just protect Darnell Rivers. You reminded the world what it means to wear this uniform." A general who once served under a command spoke with tears in his eyes. "You did what most of us couldn't. You stood tall with the whole system trying to cut you down." Helena simply replied, "It's not about me. It's about never letting anyone dishonor what we fight for." And perhaps the most touching moment came a week later. Helena received a letter. It was handwritten, carefully folded. No signature, just a return address from a small town in Georgia. Inside was a short note. "I watched what happened. My daughter wants to join the military now. She's only 12, but she said, if that lady can do it, so can I. Thank you." She held the note for a long moment, then placed it in a small wooden box she kept for memories that truly mattered. From that day forward, Helena never took that medal off, not once. Not during interviews. Not during ceremonies. Not even during quiet days walking the base. She wore it not for pride, but for the message it carried. That honor isn't just earned, it's defended, even in places where it should never be questioned. And across the country, the world remembered. They remembered the woman who stood tall in court while others tried to strip her down. They remembered the general who refused to let power rewrite principle. They remembered that moment when she said, "This medal was earned. It stays." That line ended up engraved on plaques, printed on t-shirts, shared in speeches by mayors, soldiers, students, and mothers alike. Because that moment wasn't just a personal stand. It was a public reminder of who we are at our best. When we defend truth over titles. When we protect those who protect us. When we remember that real justice doesn't wear a robe, it wears courage. And so, General Helena Morris didn't just leave a courtroom victorious. She left it as something more. A symbol. A legacy. A lesson. And because of her strength, the world was forced to remember what Real Honor looks like.